You never forget the day your entire future is decided over dinner, especially when the host turns out to be a billionaire in disguise, for Grace Thompson. A warm-hearted non-profit worker from a small town in Ohio, that day started like any other until a cold email arrived, not an invitation, but a summons. It was from the law office of Arthur Whitmore, a famously reclusive billionaire who also happened to be the estranged father of her fiancé, Matthew Whitmore. The message was short and clear. They were to attend a formal dinner at his private estate. No excuses, no rescheduling. Matthew, usually cool-headed, had been a nervous wreck for days. "My dad doesn't do normal," he kept repeating. "This is a test. Everything with him is a test." Grace quickly learned just how high the stakes were. Matthew's father had once disowned his older son over marrying someone beneath the family's stature. Now, Grace was the next to be judged. There were rules. Don't mention her non-profit work. Arthur sees charity as weakness. Don't bring up her modest upbringing. Wear the navy dress. And most importantly, don't be late. Arthur believed that tardiness wasn't just rude, it was a sign of a disordered mind. Grace tried to follow every rule, but fate and a shivering old man on a park bench had other plans. Grace stepped off the train in Fairhaven, a wealthy New England town tucked between wooded hills and quiet lakes. The air was crisp, and a light wind tugged at her scarf as she adjusted the navy blue dress Matthew had insisted she wear. Her fiancé was already at the estate, pacing no doubt, preparing for what he believed to be the most critical evening of their lives. The plan was simple, a 5-minute cab ride from the station to the Whitmore estate, but Grace felt a tight knot twisting in her stomach. The pressure, the endless rehearsing of what to say and not say, it was suffocating. She looked around at the tree-lined streets and stately homes and decided to walk. It was just under a mile. Maybe the quiet would help her steady her nerves. As she passed manicured lawns and towering iron gates, Grace couldn't help but feel out of place. She wasn't raised among mansions. Her parents were a schoolteacher and a retired nurse. They had built their life on love and sacrifice, not legacy and wealth. And now she was walking toward the judgment of a man who saw humility as a flaw. That's when she saw him. An elderly man sat alone on a park bench, just off the sidewalk, hunched forward, his thin coat barely covering his frail frame. His fingers trembled as he rubbed them together for warmth. He looked utterly alone, a human figure lost in a town of perfection. His presence clashed so sharply with the world around him, it was as if someone had dropped a watercolor sketch into a steel blueprint. Grace slowed her steps. Matthew's voice rang in her head. "Don't get involved. Don't be late. Don't ruin this for us." But something inside her refused to move forward. She took a deep breath and stepped off the path. "Excuse me, sir," she said gently. "Are you all right?" The man looked up with startlingly clear blue eyes. "Just a bit cold," he rasped. "Missed lunch at the shelter today." Grace reached into her bag and pulled out the only food she had, a turkey and Swiss sandwich, wrapped in wax paper. "It's not much," she said, offering it to him. "But it's yours." He stared at her, surprised, as if such kindness was something he hadn't seen in a long time. Slowly, he accepted the sandwich. "Thank you," he said. "That's very kind of you." She noticed him shiver again, and without a second thought, she unwound her cashmere scarf, yes, the very one Matthew insisted she wear, and draped it gently over his shoulders. "You need this more than I do." The man looked down at the soft fabric, then back at her, his expression unreadable but deeply thoughtful. "You're a very kind woman," Grace smiled. "Take care of yourself, sir." But as she turned to leave, panic struck. She glanced at her watch. 5:12 p.m. She was 12 minutes late. Her heart dropped. She took off running, her shoes sinking into the soft grass as she cut across lawns and rushed up the long, winding driveway toward the Whitmore estate. Her chest pounded not just from running, but from fear. Had she ruined everything? Had she failed this man's impossible test before even walking through the door? The towering wrought-iron gates creaked open after a long silence on the intercom. As she rushed toward the grand stone mansion, Grace saw Matthew waiting on the steps, his face pale, his jaw clenched. "Where have you been?" He hissed. "You're 17 minutes late. I ran into someone," she said between gasps. He looked cold. He hadn't eaten. "I gave him my sandwich, my scarf till he needed it." Matthew's face twisted into something unrecognizable. "A sandwich, a scarf, Grace. Do you understand what's at stake tonight? This isn't one of your charity projects. This is my father. He judges everything. You are supposed to be perfect." She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not a man defending her, but a man terrified for himself. Grace said nothing. The decision she had made on that bench might have cost her the evening, but it hadn't cost her herself. What she didn't know then was that the test she thought she failed was the only one that actually read. Matthew didn't say another word as the butler opened the grand double doors to the Whitmore mansion. His hand tightened around Grace's, clammy and trembling, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were elsewhere on a park bench, a worn face, and a scarf now gone. Inside. The foyer was vast and cold, the kind of space where voices echo and warmth feels out of place. Priceless paintings hung from the walls, glaring down like silent judges. The floor was black and white marble, polished to a mirror finish, and Grace could see the reflection of her uneasy steps as they followed the butler deeper into the house. Each footstep felt heavier than the last. Matthew leaned in, whispering frantically, "Please just let me do the talking. Don't mention anything about the man on the bench. Don't say anything about the scarf. Just a smile, be pleasant. And try not to say anything that might offend him." Grace nodded but said nothing. Her heart wasn't racing from fear anymore, it was from clarity. Something inside her had shifted. She was no longer just worried about being liked. She was wondering if this family, and this future, truly aligned with who she was. The butler paused before a towering set of dark oak doors. "Mr. Whitmore will see you now." Matthew squeezed her hand once more, and the doors opened with an almost theatrical silence. The dining room was unlike anything Grace had seen in real life. The table alone stretched nearly 20 feet. Made of mahogany so polished it reflected the light like water. Above it hung a glittering crystal chandelier, heavy with age and authority. And at the far end of the table, seated alone beneath all the splendor, was a single man. Grace's breath caught. The man's posture was straight, regal. His grey hair was slicked back. His suit, though expensive, was rumpled, but what struck her cold was the flash of familiar color wrapped around his shoulders. The scarf, her scarf, the cashmere scarf she had tied around the shivering man in the park. Grace stopped in her tracks, frozen. Her mind scrambled for explanation, denial. It can't be, it just can't be. But then he looked up, and the same clear blue eyes that had met hers in quiet gratitude now locked with her once again. Matthew kept walking, still rambling in a whisper, completely unaware. "Remember, firm handshake, no politics, avoid talking about the non-profit." Then he turned and noticed Grace wasn't beside him. "Grace," he hissed, "what's wrong?" She didn't answer. Matthew followed her gaze, slowly turning to the head of the table. His words dried up, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Dad," he finally choked, What are you wearing? What's going on?" Arthur Whitmore, the man who hadn't been seen in public for nearly a decade, smiled but not at his son. "Grace," he said warmly, gesturing to the seat beside him. "Please, have a seat. I owe you a proper dinner and perhaps an explanation." Grace stepped forward slowly, her heels echoing across the hardwood floor, the surreal weight of the moment settling over her. She sat down quietly, unsure if she was still in the same story she thought she was living. Matthew remained standing, paralyzed by confusion and dread. Arthur turned toward him, his tone now colder. His voice sharp as crystal. "You seem surprised. To see me, son, you shouldn't be. You know I care little for wealth or image. What I value, what I've always valued is character, and I've spent years trying to find it, quietly. When no one knows I'm watching," he turned back to Grace, "and today I found it in you." Grace's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, but Arthur raised a hand gently. "You didn't just give a man your lunch," he continued. "You gave your comfort, your warmth, your dignity for a stranger. While everyone else in this town walked past, you saw me, not as a bum, but as a man in need." Matthew sank slowly into a chair at the far end of the table, as far from his father as possible. Arthur leaned forward. "Your fiancé has spent years fearing my judgment. But he never stopped to consider that I might judge him not for his wealth or success, but for how he treats others, especially those who have nothing to offer him." The room was heavy with silence. Grace felt a lump rising in her throat, not from fear, but from something close to awe. She had passed the real test without ever knowing she was taking it. Matthew sat rigid at the far end of the dining table, shoulders hunched like a schoolboy caught cheating on a test he didn't know was being given. His face, once flushed with anger on the porch, had turned pale. Grace sat near Arthur, unsure whether to feel honored or overwhelmed. Arthur leaned back slightly in his chair and looked directly at his son, no longer as a distant patriarch, but as a disappointed man. "You know, Matthew," he said evenly, "I've had this same dinner dozens of times. Powerful men and women have sat in this very room, some wearing $5,000 suits, others rehearsing their charm like politicians. They come in here performing. But that's all it ever is, performance." He gestured toward Grace. "And then comes this young woman. No script, no polished background, just heart, kindness, the kind of instinct that money can't teach and upbringing can't fake." While others stepped over a man on a bench, she stopped. She saw me, not the billionaire, recluse, not the Whitmore test, just a human being, cold and hungry. "That," he said firmly, "is character." Matthew tried to speak but faltered. The weight of his father's words was crushing, and for once he had nothing clever or defensive to say. Arthur turned back to Grace, the sternness in his voice softening. "When Matthew told me he was marrying a non-profit worker from rural Ohio, I'll admit I expected another social climber trying to impress me. That's why I had to be sure. That's why I still test people, not with questions or interviews, with quiet moments, when no one thinks I'm watching." Grace nodded slowly, humbled. "I didn't help you because I thought anyone was watching," she said gently. "I helped because you looked like someone who needed a little kindness." Arthur's eyes twinkled. "Exactly." He gestured toward the seat next to him. "That's why you're sitting here. That's why. When I step back from this company, one day, the future I'm most interested in is not in market strategies or investment portfolios, it's in people like you. People who still care when there's nothing to gain." Grace sat silently for a moment, absorbing the gravity of what he was saying. Matthew, finally finding his voice, said quietly, "So, what now?" Arthur didn't look at him at first. He took a sip of water, set the glass down with calm precision, then met his son's gaze. "Now," he said, "now you listen. You have a remarkable woman beside you. And you nearly lost her because you were more concerned with impressing me than supporting her." The word stung. Matthew lowered his eyes. "I built this empire with my name," Arthur continued, "but it'll survive with something more than legacy. It needs integrity. You still have a place in my world, son, but let's be clear, it's because of her. Grace felt a lump in her throat. She hadn't come here to be anyone's savior, but somehow this moment had become a mirror one that revealed what truly mattered, not just to Arthur, but to herself. Arthur stood slowly and deliberately. Let's not drag this out. Grace, I'd like to learn more about you, your work, your passions, your values. Matthew, you're welcome to stay and listen, or you can go home. The choice, for once, is yours. Grace looked across the long stretch of table. Matthew's eyes were glassy, his jaw clenched. The man who had once seemed so confident now looked entirely unsure of himself. But Arthur looked at her the way a father might look at the daughter he never had but always wanted. She knew, right then, that she hadn't just passed his test. She had earned his respect, and perhaps, for the first time in his life, so had Matthew if he was humble enough to accept the lesson. Dinner that night unfolded in a way no one least of all Grace could have anticipated. The butler, silent and swift, served each course with practiced elegance. The plates were delicate porcelain, the silverware engraved with the Whitmore family crest. And yet nothing about the evening felt like a celebration of status. No, this wasn't a display of wealth. This was something far rarer, an honest conversation. And it wasn't between father and son. Arthur Whitmore directed nearly all his attention to Grace. He asked about the book she was reading, her work with children at the community garden, and what she found most meaningful about helping people with limited resources. His questions weren't surface-level pleasantries. He listened with the attentiveness of a man who had spent years surrounded by people who only wanted to impress him and had finally found someone who Grace, at first cautious, began to open up. She spoke of her parents who raised her on love, second-hand paperbacks, and homemade soup. She told Arthur about her upbringing in a modest bedroom home in Columbus, and how she'd learned that decency wasn't about what you had, but how you treated others. Arthur's expression didn't change much, but Grace noticed his eyes linger longer. His nods grew slower. He wasn't judging. He was absorbing. Across the table, Matthew sat silently, pushing his food around. The man who had once warned Grace not to embarrass him was now a ghost at his own family's table, and when the final course was cleared, Arthur reached up, unwrapped the scarf from around his shoulders, and folded it with care. He placed it on the table between them and said softly, "This is yours." Grace hesitated. "It was a comfort to me," Arthur added, almost reverently, "but it doesn't belong to me." You gave it without hesitation. "That means more than anything anyone's ever tried to buy me." The dinner ended not with a toast, but with quiet understanding. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Arthur walked them to the front door himself. Just before parting, he turned to Matthew not with disdain, but with restrained firmness. "You have a remarkable woman standing beside you," he said. "Don't make the mistake of underestimating her again. Your place in my life, and in this company, is secure not because of your own actions tonight, but because of hers." There was nothing left to say. The words hung in the air like morning fog, soft, heavy, inescapable. The drive home was silent. Matthew gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, eyes fixed on the road. Grace didn't press him. There was nothing to gain in prodding the man who had just witnessed the foundation of his identity shaken by a few kind gestures and a scarf. When they arrived at their apartment, Matthew sat on the edge of the couch, still in his dress clothes, and finally broke. He wept. Not the angry tears of a man who'd been embarrassed, but the gut-wrenching sobs of someone who had seen himself clearly for the first time and didn't like what he saw. "I'm sorry," he whispered through trembling hands, "not just for today, for everything, for trying to mold you into someone you're not, for being so afraid of my father that I forgot who I was, and who you are." Grace sat beside him and didn't speak. She simply laid a hand on his back, a quiet gesture of reassurance. In that moment, their relationship shifted, not broken, not perfect, but finally real, for the first time in years. Grace saw not the ambitious, polished version of Matthew Whitmore, but the vulnerable man underneath all flaws, all fear, all hope. And somehow, that was enough. 3 months later, Grace stood in the backyard of her childhood home. Barefoot in the soft Ohio grass, sunlight weaving through the branches. Above, the garden was in full bloom, her mother's peonies along the fence line, daisies near the porch, and mason jars filled with baby's breath hanging from shepherd hooks in the ground. It wasn't the wedding Matthew's family had originally imagined. There were no chandeliers, no catering contracts, no string quartet flown in from Boston. Instead, there was barbecue brisket on real plates, lemonade in pitchers, and laughter floating through the air like dandelion seeds, and that's exactly how Grace had wanted it, there, under the simple wooden arch her father had built himself. Grace looked into Matthew's eyes, not the old Matthew, all bluster and polish, but the man he had finally become. A man who no longer measured success by his father's standards, but by his own capacity to listen, to change, and to love. The small gathering of family and close friends fell silent as she and Matthew exchanged vows. They were simple and sincere. No grand declarations, just the quiet promises that come from weathering something hard and choosing to grow from it together. But what caught everyone's attention most that day wasn't in the vows or the rings. It was the man. Sitting in the front row, Arthur Whitmore. Gone was the aloof billionaire. In his place sat a dignified man in a tailored grey suit, silver hair neatly combed, posture proud. But what stood out wasn't the suit. It was the scarf. Grace's cashmere scarf, soft, sky blue, wrapped gently around his shoulders like a medal of honor. He wore it not as a fashion statement, not as some nostalgic token, but as a declaration, a reminder that kindness, quiet and unassuming, had the power to cut through decades of cynicism, silence, and solitude. Several guests recognized Arthur from old business journals or TV interviews from years past, but none approached him. They didn't need to. He wasn't there as a billionaire, he was there as family. After the ceremony, Arthur approached Grace. He stood in front of her like a man seeing someone off to war or welcoming them home. Something monumental, something sacred. You taught me something, he said softly. After all these years, you reminded me what integrity actually looks like, not on a balance sheet, but on a park bench. Grace smiled, tears in her eyes. You reminded me that people are watching, especially when we think they're not. He nodded. Then he reached up, took the scarf from his shoulders, and gently placed it back around hers. This is where it belongs. No, she said, voice shaking slightly. It's yours. He shook his head. It was never mine. I was just the one lucky enough to receive it when I needed it most. Behind them, Matthew stood with a quiet humility that had become his new skin. He no longer looked like a man desperate for approval. He looked like someone who had learned to stand on his own. Arthur turned to his son. You did well today. Matthew didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply placed a hand on Grace's back and looked his father in the eye. I did better the day I stopped trying to pass your test, he said. Arthur smiled, a glint of pride in his eyes. Then, for the first time in many years, he pulled his son into a firm, quiet embrace. In that small backyard, amid the flowers and folding chairs and laughter. 3 lives changed not because of money or reputation or power, but because of one forgotten sandwich and a scarf freely given. Months had passed since the backyard wedding, but Grace often found herself thinking back to that park bench. Not because it was dramatic or strange, but because it was so ordinary, so easy to walk past, so easy to miss, and yet That quiet choice, offering half a sandwich and a little warmth, had changed the course of 3 lives. Arthur Whitmore, once a man hidden behind walls of wealth and suspicion, now visited regularly, not as a towering figure of power, but as a father and grandfather in waiting. He'd become a supporter of Grace's non-profit work, donating not just funds but his time. He asked questions, offered ideas, and most importantly, listened. Matthew, too, was no longer the same man. He still worked in his father's business, but he no longer chased titles or tried to impress anyone. He took up coaching Little League baseball on weekends. He learned how to plant tomatoes in Grace's community garden. He'd found something stronger than his father's approval. He had found peace in being present. One evening, as autumn settled into the leaves, Grace found the scarf tucked neatly in a cedar box on the bookshelf. She ran her fingers across the soft threads, remembering the cold day it left her shoulders and the warmth that had followed. She smiled. It was never about the scarf. It was about the moment she chose to be human. When no one of consequence appeared to be watching, Arthur had said it best that night at dinner, "The only currency that ever truly mattered is kindness." And in the quiet of that memory, Grace finally understood something deeper. The world doesn't change in grand speeches or boardroom deals. It changes in park benches, in everyday choices, in the pause between what's expected and what's right. So, if you've made it to the end of this story, let me leave you with this. The next time you see someone in need, someone who looks like they've been forgotten by the world, pause. Offer what you can, even if it's just your time, a meal, a scarf, because you never know who's watching, and more importantly, you never know whose life you might be saving, including your own. Have you ever had a moment like this, a simple act of kindness that changed everything? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe for more meaningful stories that remind us what truly matters. Your support helps us bring real, powerful moments like this to life every week. Thanks for watching, and remember, true wealth is measured not by what you keep, but by what you give away.